I remember the exact moment it all began to unravel. I was sitting at my vanity, brushing out the tangles from my hair, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on the bedroom walls. The air was still, save for the muffled hum of the TV from the living room where Ethan was sitting. It was one of those nights where the silence wasn't comforting. It was loud, stretching between us like something physical. I could feel it pressing against my chest, and I hated it. My phone buzzed next to me, and I didn't have to look to know who it was. I picked it up anyway, letting my thumb hover over the screen. "Great time tonight, Olivia. Appreciate you." Andrew's message stared back at me, and for a second I could almost hear his voice, warm, steady, effortlessly confident. The same way it had sounded earlier over dinner, when we'd shared a bottle of wine and laughed about everything and nothing. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, just dinner after a late meeting. Ethan would understand, or at least I hoped he would. But I hadn't mentioned it when I walked through the door an hour ago, offering only a quick, busy day before slipping past him to our bedroom. I hadn't told him about the restaurant, or the wine, or the way Andrew had smiled at me when I told a joke. Standing up, I smoothed my hands over my dress and made my way to the living room. Ethan was there, his shoulders hunched slightly as he leaned against the armrest of the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I entered, his face neutral but his eyes. I couldn't read them. "How was work?" he asked, his tone flat. "Busy," I said quickly, too quickly. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, and I cleared my throat, trying again. "We had some reports to finalize." "Long day." He murmured, turning his attention back to the TV. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I wanted him to say. Maybe I wanted him to push, to ask questions, to care. But he didn't. And maybe that's why I didn't tell him the rest. That Andrew had invited me out, that I'd said yes without hesitation, that I'd felt a thrill in the way his eyes lingered on me as I spoke. Ethan didn't say anything else, and I sat down on the other end of the couch, the space between us feeling wider than the furniture allowed. I stared at the screen without really watching it, my mind racing. It wasn't about Andrew. It couldn't be. I loved Ethan. At least I thought I did. But lately, I'd felt like I was fading into the background of my own life. Work was the only place I felt noticed, and Andrew, he noticed. "Long day," Ethan said, repeating my words as if to himself. I glanced at him, startled, but his expression didn't change. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile he didn't see. "Long day." We went to bed soon after, side by side but miles apart. I stared at the ceiling, my heart heavy with emotions I didn't fully understand. Guilt. Resentment. Longing. They all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untie. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to say that I felt lost, that I needed him to notice me the way Andrew had tonight. But I didn't. The words stayed lodged in my throat, and the silence between us stretched on. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Ethan moving around in the kitchen. The smell of coffee drifted into the bedroom, but it didn't carry the warmth it usually did. I lay there for a moment, staring at the sunlight streaming through the blinds, the weight in my chest still as heavy as it had been the night before. When I finally got up and walked into the kitchen, Ethan was sitting at the table, his phone in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. His eyes flicked up to mine briefly before returning to the screen. "Morning," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Morning," he replied without looking at me again. The silence was unbearable. I busied myself with pouring a cup of coffee, hoping the mundane act would fill the space between us. But I could feel his presence, the tension radiating off him like heat. "How's your schedule today?" I asked, desperate to break the quiet. "Same as always," he said, his tone clipped. I turned to face him, leaning against the counter. "You okay?" He looked up at that, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah, why wouldn't I be?" I opened my mouth to answer but stopped. What could I say? That I could feel the weight of everything unspoken between us. That I knew my silence about last night was more telling than I wanted to admit. Instead, I shook my head. "No reason, just, you seem off." He let out a humorless laugh and stood, taking his mug to the sink. "I'm fine, Olivia." As he walked past me, I caught a faint whiff of his cologne mixed with something else, something bitter and unfamiliar. My stomach twisted. He didn't usually wear cologne on weekdays, and I hadn't seen him put it on this morning. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I was overthinking. After Ethan left for work, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the mug he'd left behind. I thought about last night, about the way he'd looked at me when I came home late, and how I'd avoided his eyes. I thought about Andrew's text, and the way it had made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I told myself it wasn't about Ethan or Andrew. It was about me. About the version of myself I missed, the confident, carefree woman I used to be before life became so monotonous. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. When I got to the office, Andrew was already there, standing by the window in his corner office, coffee in hand. He smiled when he saw me, his eyes lighting up in a way that made my heart flutter and my stomach churn simultaneously. "Morning, Olivia," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. As the day went on, I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting. Ethan's curt tone, the tension in his posture, the scent of cologne that didn't belong. It gnawed at me, a whisper at the back of my mind that grew louder with every passing hour. Andrew stopped by my desk at lunchtime, leaning casually against the edge. "You okay? You seem a little distracted." I looked up at him, startled. "Yeah, I'm fine, just a lot on my mind." He nodded, his gaze searching mine. "If you ever want to talk." I smiled tightly, grateful when he didn't push further. But as he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he saw more than I wanted him to. That night, Ethan came home late. Later than usual. He offered no explanation, just a mumbled "hey" as he walked past me into the bedroom. I waited for him to say something, anything, but he didn't. I sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, my thoughts spiraling. Was he pulling away? Or was I just imagining it? I glanced at my phone, Andrew's text from the night before still sitting there, unanswered. I thought about replying, about starting a conversation that would distract me from the growing chasm between Ethan and me. But something stopped me. Instead, I typed a single message to Ethan. "Are we okay?" I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the send button, but I didn't press it. I put the phone down and leaned back against the couch, the silence of the house pressing in on me. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that things were shifting. I just didn't know which way they would fall. The days that followed were a blur of half-conversations and unspoken words. Ethan and I moved around each other like strangers sharing the same space, careful not to touch the fragile threads that bound us. It was exhausting, pretending that everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. I kept telling myself that I wasn't doing anything wrong. Dinner with Andrew had been professional, even if it didn't feel that way. His text messages were polite, not flirtatious. It wasn't like I was hiding anything, except, of course, I was. I'd chosen to keep it from Ethan, to let the details of that night's stay locked away, and that choice hung between us like a shadow. Ethan's distance wasn't helping. He came home later every night, offering vague excuses about work running long. He avoided eye contact when we talked, his responses curt and impersonal. Every time I tried to ask him if something was wrong, he'd brush me off, saying he was tired or distracted. One evening, as I sat at the dining table picking at my dinner, I heard Ethan's phone buzz on the counter. He didn't move to check it, so I glanced over instinctively. A name I didn't recognize flashed on the screen. Kara. My stomach dropped. It was probably nothing, I told myself. A coworker, a friend, someone from his gym. But the way he'd been acting lately, the late nights, the distance, the faint scent of cologne made it impossible to push the thought away. When he came back into the room, I tried to keep my voice steady. "Who's Kara?" He froze for a fraction of a second before reaching for his phone. "Just someone from work," he said casually. Too casually. "What does she want?" Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in what felt like days. "Why does it matter?" I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath as he grabbed his plate and walked into the kitchen. I sat there, staring at the empty space where he'd been, my heart pounding. The roles had reversed, and I hated it. I hated that I was the one asking questions now, feeling suspicious and insecure. Later that night, as I lay in bed pretending to sleep, I felt him get up and leave the room. The soft glow of his phone illuminated the hallway, and I could hear the low murmur of his voice. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The knot in my stomach tightened with every muffled syllable. When he finally came back to bed, I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady. He didn't say anything, didn't touch me, didn't even look in my direction. The next morning, I found myself staring at Andrew's number in my phone again. I thought about sending a message, starting a conversation that would fill the emptiness Ethan had left. But I didn't. Instead, I threw myself into my work, hoping it would distract me. Andrew stopped by my desk a few times, always with that easy smile, always with a compliment or a kind word. It was tempting the way he made me feel, noticed, appreciated like I mattered. At lunch, he invited me to join him again, and for a moment, I hesitated. I thought about Ethan, about the way his shoulders tensed every time I spoke to him, about the cold distance in his eyes. And I thought about Kara, about her name lighting up his phone screen, about the secrets he was keeping from me. "Sure," I said finally, forcing a smile. That evening, I came home later than usual. Ethan was already there, sitting on the couch with his laptop. He didn't look up when I walked in, didn't acknowledge me at all. "I'm back," I said, setting my bag down. "Okay," he replied without lifting his head. I stood there for a moment, waiting for something, anything, but he didn't say another word. I wanted to tell him where I'd been, to confess everything and lay it all out in the open. But the words caught in my throat, tangled with my pride and fear and resentment. Instead, I turned and walked into the bedroom, closing the door behind me. For the first time, I realized that whatever we had left was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. The following morning, I woke to the sound of Ethan moving quietly around the room. His movements were deliberate, careful not to wake me, but I kept my eyes closed, unwilling to face the strained silence that had become our routine. I heard the rustle of his clothes, the click of his belt buckle, the soft sigh he let out as he grabbed his phone from the nightstand. I wondered if Kara's name would flash across his screen again today. The thought burned in my chest, but I swallowed it down, pretending to sleep until the front door closed behind him. When I finally got up, the emptiness of the house felt heavier than usual. I lingered over my coffee, staring at the clock as if time would reverse itself if I willed it hard enough. My phone buzzed on the counter, jolting me out of my thoughts. "Morning, Olivia. Let me know if you need anything today. Great work yesterday." Andrew's message was simple, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I started typing a response, erasing and rewriting it several times before settling on a curt, "Thanks, Andrew." I hit send and immediately regretted it. Too formal, too dismissive. I could almost hear the confusion in his voice if he read it aloud. By the time I arrived at the office, Andrew was already there, leaning against the reception desk, chatting with one of our colleagues. His eyes lit up when he saw me, and I felt a strange mix of guilt and exhilaration. "Olivia," he said, his voice warm as always. "Morning." "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. He followed me to my desk, leaning casually against the partition as I settled in. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. "Yeah, why? You just seem, I don't know, preoccupied." I glanced up at him, startled by how perceptive he was. "Just a lot on my mind," I said finally. His expression softened, and for a moment I thought he was going to press further. Instead, he gave me a reassuring smile. "Well, if you need a break, let me know. We could grab coffee later." "Thanks," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The day dragged on, my mind torn between work and the chaos of my personal life. Ethan's behavior lingered in the back of my mind, a constant hum of anxiety I couldn't shake. Every time my phone buzzed, I found myself hoping it was him, even though I knew it wouldn't be. At lunch, I found myself standing in front of Andrew's office, hesitating. He glanced up from his desk and smiled when he saw me. "Coffee?" he asked, already reaching for his jacket. I nodded, unable to find my voice. We walked to a cafe a few blocks away, the conversation flowing easily between us. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe, like someone actually saw me. Andrew talked about his weekend plans, his family, his favorite movies, simple things that made me forget for a moment the mess I was living in. When we returned to the office, he touched my arm lightly as we parted ways. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That evening, I came home to an empty house. Ethan's text came an hour later, working late. "Don't wait up." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. I thought about calling him, asking where he really was, but I knew it would only lead to another fight. Instead, I opened a bottle of wine and sat on the couch, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. Andrew's number hovered at the top of my recent messages, and before I could stop myself, I tapped on it. "Thanks for the coffee today," I typed. His reply came almost instantly. "Anytime, you okay?" I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. For a moment, I thought about telling him everything, about Ethan, about Kara, about the way my life felt like it was unraveling. But I didn't. "Just tired," I replied. "Let me know if you need to talk," he wrote back. I set my phone down and stared at the glass of wine in my hand. The silence of the house felt suffocating, and for the first time, I wondered if Ethan felt the same way when he came home. When I finally crawled into bed, the sheets felt cold and unfamiliar. Ethan still wasn't home. I stared at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on me, and wondered how much longer we could keep pretending this wasn't falling apart. Ethan didn't come home until well past midnight. I heard him moving around the kitchen, his steps deliberate but heavy, as if the effort of walking through the door had drained him. I stayed in bed, my heart pounding as I listened to him move through the house. When he finally slipped into the bedroom, the smell of alcohol hit me before I even opened my eyes. I turned over to face him, squinting at the dim outline of his figure as he sat on the edge of the bed. "Late night," I said softly, my voice catching in my throat. "Yeah," he replied, not turning to look at me. I sat up, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders. "Ethan, what's going on?" "Nothing," he said quickly, the words sharp enough to sting. "Don't do that," I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Don't just shut me out." He let out a bitter laugh, finally turning to face me. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression unreadable. "Shut you out, that's rich, Olivia." I froze, the air between us crackling with tension. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Nothing, forget it." "No," I said firmly, my voice rising. "You don't get to throw that out and then tell me to forget it. Just say it." Ethan stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. "Where were you tonight?" His question caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't answer. What? You heard me," he said, his voice low and steady. "Where were you?" I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "I was at work late," I said, hating how shaky my voice sounded. "Really?" he asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Because I called your office. They said you left hours ago." My stomach dropped. "You called my office. Don't turn this around on me," he snapped, standing up. "Just answer the question." I felt my cheeks flush with heat, a mix of anger and guilt rising in my chest. "I went out for coffee with Andrew," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan laughed, but it wasn't a laugh I recognized. It was bitter, cold, and laced with something that made my heart ache. "Andrew," he repeated, shaking his head. "Of course. It wasn't like that," I said quickly, standing to face him. "It was just coffee. We were talking about work." "Work," he said, his voice rising. "Is that what you call it now? Late-night dinners, coffee breaks. What else have you been doing with him, Olivia?" His words hit me like a slap, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "Don't you dare accuse me of something like that," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "What am I supposed to think?" he shot back. "You've been distant for weeks, sneaking around, lying to me." "I'm not the one lying," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "Who's Kara, Ethan?" The room went silent, the name hanging in the air like a loaded gun. Ethan's expression hardened, and I could see the faint flicker of guilt in his eyes. "You're deflecting," he said finally, his voice cold. "Am I?" I asked, stepping closer. "I saw her name on your phone. I heard you talking to her. So don't stand there and act like I'm the only one keeping secrets." Ethan's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said through gritted teeth. "Then tell me," I said, my voice breaking. "Tell me who she is." He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, my chest heaving, tears streaming down my face. The house felt impossibly quiet, the only sound the faint echo of the door slamming shut. For the first time, I realized that whatever was left of our marriage was hanging by a thread, and I didn't know if either of us had the strength to hold on. The house felt suffocatingly quiet after Ethan stormed out. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, hoping he'd come back, say something, anything. That would make the tension evaporate. But the minutes stretched into an hour, and the silence remained unbroken. I sank onto the edge of the bed, burying my face in my hands. My chest felt hollow, my thoughts tangled in a storm of anger, guilt, and confusion. How had it come to this? I replayed every moment of the past few weeks, trying to pinpoint the exact second we'd started drifting apart, but all I found were fragments, small moments of silence, missed chances to connect, things left unsaid. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling me. I reached for it instinctively, my heart sinking when I saw Andrew's name. "Hey, just checking in, everything okay?" I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. A part of me wanted to reply, to pour everything out to someone who seemed willing to listen. But another part of me hesitated. If I answered, it would feel like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Instead, I put the phone down and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I thought about Ethan, about the way his voice had cracked when he'd accused me of sneaking around, about the guilt in his eyes when I mentioned Kara. I thought about all the things we weren't saying to each other, the walls we were building higher with every passing day. When Ethan finally came back hours later, the sound of the front door creaking open pulled me out of a restless sleep. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, slower and heavier than usual. He didn't come into the bedroom. Instead, he went into the kitchen, and a few moments later, I heard the faint clink of glass. I got up, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders, and padded out to find him. He was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him, his head in his hands. "Ethan," I said softly, standing in the doorway. He didn't look up. "Go back to bed, Olivia." "I can't," I said, my voice trembling. "Not like this." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Not like what? With us falling apart, with you and Andrew, me and—" He stopped himself, his voice breaking. I stepped closer, my chest tightening. "You and who?" Ethan finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with something I couldn't quite read. "Kara's a friend," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's going through a divorce. I've been helping her." "Helping her," I repeated, my tone incredulous. "By sneaking around, by lying to me." "I wasn't sneaking around," he said, his voice rising. "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd assume the worst, just like you always do." I flinched at his words, the sting of them cutting deeper than I expected. "Maybe I assumed the worst because you gave me every reason to," I shot back. "And what about you?" he said, standing abruptly. "You think I don't notice the way you look at your phone when you think I'm not watching? The way you light up when you talk about Andrew. Don't stand there and pretend you're innocent in all this, Olivia." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it, but the truth was lodged in my throat, impossible to ignore. I started, but my voice faltered. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like neither of us knows how to be honest anymore." The room fell silent, the tension between us almost unbearable. I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "I don't know how we got here." Ethan let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "Neither do I." For a moment we just stood there, staring at each other, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance, to say something that would fix it, but I didn't know how. "I'm sleeping on the couch," he said eventually, his voice hollow. I nodded, unable to say anything else. As he walked past me, I felt the cold air of his absence settle over me, and for the first time, I wondered if we were already too far gone to come back. I woke up the next morning to an empty bed and the faint sound of Ethan moving around in the kitchen. The heaviness from the night before still clung to me, the weight of his words making it hard to breathe. I stayed under the covers, staring at the ceiling, trying to summon the energy to face him again. Eventually, the smell of coffee pulled me out of bed. I found him sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open, a mug in his hand. He didn't look up when I entered. "Morning," I said, my voice tentative. "Morning," he replied, his tone flat. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the silence stretching between us like an ocean. I wanted to say something, anything, but I didn't know where to start. As I sat across from him, he finally closed his laptop and looked at me. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this." My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" This, he said, gesturing between us. Whatever this is, the distance. The distrust. It's not sustainable, Olivia. I stared into my coffee, my hands trembling. I don't want to give up on us, Ethan. Then why does it feel like you already have? He asked, his voice soft but laced with hurt. I looked up at him, tears blurring my vision. That's not fair. Isn't it? He countered. You've been pulling away for months. You're distracted, distant. You've been leaning on someone else instead of me. How is that not giving up? I didn't mean to, I said, my voice cracking. I felt like you weren't there for me, like you didn't care anymore. Ethan's expression softened, but his eyes remained guarded. I've been here, Olivia. Maybe I haven't been perfect, but I've been here. We sat in silence for a moment, the tension between us thick and suffocating. I thought about all the times I could have reached out to him, all the moments I let slip by because I was too wrapped up in my own feelings to notice his. I don't know how to fix this, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Neither do I, he said, leaning back in his chair. But I don't think we can if we keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't just a rough patch or a misunderstanding. This was us unraveling, piece by piece, and I didn't know if we could put ourselves back together. Do you still love me? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Ethan looked at me, his eyes searching mine. I do, he said after a long pause, but I don't know if love is enough anymore. The honesty in his voice cut deeper than any argument we'd ever had. I wanted to argue to tell him that love was enough, that we could get through this if we just tried harder. But a part of me wasn't sure I believed it. I want to try, I said, my voice trembling. Even if it's hard, even if it hurts. I don't want to lose us, Ethan. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then we need to be honest about everything. No more half-truths, no more avoiding the hard conversations. If we're going to fix this, we have to face it head on. I swallowed hard, nodding. Okay, I'll tell you everything. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes locked on mine. And I'll do the same, he said. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. As we sat there, the sun streaming through the kitchen window, I realized that this wasn't the end of our story. It was just another chapter. And while I didn't know how it would end, I knew I wasn't ready to close the book just yet. The next few days felt like a slow-motion unraveling. Ethan and I went through the motions. Small talk at breakfast, silent glances at dinner, the absence of connection hanging heavy between us. The emptiness was more suffocating than the fighting. It was the silence, the unspoken things between us that seemed to pierce deeper than any sharp words ever could. I found myself retreating into work more than ever, burying myself in tasks I didn't care about. I threw myself into busy work as though the distraction could drown out the growing realization that I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending. I wasn't sure how much longer Ethan could either. I avoided looking at him, avoided touching him. It wasn't that I didn't want to, no. There were times when I could feel the pull, the ache for the man I had married. But every time I looked at him, I saw something else. Distance hurt, a wall that neither of us seemed able to break down. And then, as if to punish myself further, I found myself replaying every conversation I had had with Andrew over the past few weeks. It had started so innocently. Coffee breaks, a few shared lunches, small discussions about work. But with each passing day, the boundary between what was professional and what wasn't became blurrier. Andrew seemed so present, so willing to listen in ways I hadn't realized I needed. He saw me, really saw me, and I couldn't deny how intoxicating that felt. I hated myself for it. One evening, after yet another silent dinner with Ethan, I found myself reaching for my phone. Andrew's name flashed across the screen in a text, and I hesitated, feeling a mixture of guilt and relief. It was like a lifeline thrown to me in a sea I had been drowning in for weeks. The message was simple. How are you holding up? I typed back immediately, my fingers flying over the keys without thinking. Not well. Everything feels so broken. A few seconds later, he responded. Do you want to talk? I stared at the message, my heart racing in my chest. I knew this was wrong. I knew I was only adding fuel to the fire by confiding in him the way I was, but the thought of being seen, of being heard without judgment, was too much to resist. Before I could stop myself, I typed back, "Yeah, I need to talk." I felt guilty even as I sent it, and when my phone buzzed again, a simple "call me," my chest tightened, my thoughts clouded. I glanced toward the living room, where Ethan was sitting, flipping through channels, his eyes vacant. He hadn't asked me about anything all day, hadn't even seemed to care that I had been distant. My stomach twisted into knots. I got up from the kitchen table, holding my phone tightly as I walked to the bedroom, shutting the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed and hit the call button. "Hey," Andrew said, his voice smooth and familiar, a comfort I didn't deserve. "Hi," I whispered, feeling like a traitor even as I spoke the word. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the faint sound of his breathing. "Olivia, what's going on?" His voice was gentle, concerned. I couldn't stop myself. "I don't know what to do anymore, Andrew. I feel like I'm losing everything. Losing Ethan, losing myself. Do you still want to be with him?" Andrew asked, his voice careful, as if he already knew the answer but wanted to hear it from me. I swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill. "I don't know. I don't know who I am with him anymore. I don't know how to fix it." "You don't have to fix it alone, you know," he said quietly. I leaned back against the headboard, closing my eyes. His words, even though kind, felt like a promise I couldn't keep. The whole thing felt wrong, yet at the same time it felt like the only place I could turn. "Maybe it's too late," I whispered, barely believing the words as they left my lips. There was another pause before Andrew spoke again, this time more hesitantly. "Olivia, I want you to know that I care about you. You don't have to go through this alone, even if I'm not the one who can fix it for you." His words were like a balm, soothing the raw edges of my pain, but the guilt came rushing back in full force. I was standing on a line, caught between two worlds, and I wasn't sure which one I belonged to anymore. Ethan had been my everything, but I couldn't keep pretending that the spark was still there. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking as I clutched the phone tighter. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You don't have to apologize," Andrew said softly. "But you do have to decide what you want, for yourself, not for me, not for anyone else, just for you." The weight of his words pressed down on me. I stayed silent for a moment, the sound of my own breath the only thing I could focus on. "I don't know what I want," I whispered. "I don't know who I am anymore." And just like that, I felt myself starting to unravel piece by piece. I barely slept that night. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and guilt, torn between the man I had vowed to spend my life with and the man who was, in many ways, starting to fill a void I wasn't even aware existed. Andrew's words kept echoing in my mind. "You have to decide what you want, for yourself." But I didn't know how to make that choice. How could I choose between two people, two lives, two paths when neither one seemed to lead to anything certain? Ethan hadn't spoken to me all morning. I hadn't spoken to him either. We passed each other in the kitchen without exchanging more than a few words. I felt like a stranger in my own home, walking through a life that felt foreign to me. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, and I didn't know how to break the silence, even though every part of me wanted to. I caught a glimpse of Ethan sitting on the couch later that day, his face drawn, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. He looked defeated, but when our eyes met, there was no anger, just resignation. I felt the same in that moment, resigned. Resigned to the fact that maybe things weren't fixable, that perhaps we had reached the end of the road. But what if it wasn't the end? What if this was just a temporary collapse, a moment of reckoning we had to go through to find a way back to each other? I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that the love we had, the connection we had once shared, could pull us through this. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe we weren't just broken. Maybe we were fundamentally mismatched now. I found myself wandering into the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water, anything to fill the void that was slowly swallowing me. Ethan didn't even look up when I walked past him. I could hear the faint hum of the TV, but the sound seemed distant, like it was coming from somewhere else. I closed my eyes, leaning against the counter for support, as if the physical space around me could somehow hold my fractured thoughts together. Then the phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting another message from Andrew, but it wasn't. It was Ethan. "I think we need to talk," it said, simple and direct. I stared at the words for a long time, my heart racing. Talk. We had talked so many times before, but it had always been small, fleeting conversations that danced around the real issues. This time, it was different. This time, I felt the weight of his words in a way I hadn't before. He didn't want to dance around it anymore. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I typed back. "When?" "Now," came his reply. I walked into the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. Ethan was still sitting there, his hands resting on his knees, his expression unreadable. He didn't look surprised when I entered, but he didn't look relieved either. It was like he had been waiting for this moment, just as I had. "Olivia," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I can't keep doing this." The words landed like a heavy blow. I had known this was coming, had felt it in the air for days, but hearing it out loud from his lips made it real. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I don't want this either," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to fix it." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't think we can fix it, Olivia. At least not the way things are right now. I don't know how much more of this I can take." His words cut through me, and I felt a wave of emotion crash over me. Anger, frustration, guilt, but beneath it all, there was a deep, aching sadness. I had never wanted this. I had never wanted to reach a point where we were staring at the possibility of losing each other, but it was becoming clear that was exactly where we were. "I never wanted to hurt you," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't even know when it started, but I think I've been hurting you for a long time." Ethan looked at me, his eyes searching mine, but there was no judgment there, only pain. "I'm not angry at you," he said softly. "I'm just tired, Olivia. I don't know who we are anymore." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle on my chest. This was it. This was the moment where we both faced the reality that we had reached the end of this road. I thought about everything I had done, everything I hadn't done, and felt an overwhelming sense of regret. But at the same time, there was a small part of me that knew, deep down, that we were already too far apart to ever truly fix things. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "For everything." Ethan nodded, but there was a finality to his gesture that told me it was too late for apologies. His expression softened, but it didn't change the truth that was hanging in the air between us. "We've been breaking for a while now, Olivia," he said, "and maybe this is just how it ends." And in that moment, I felt the truth of his words settle in my bones. We couldn't go back. We had already let go of too much. The days that followed were a blur. Ethan moved out. He didn't take much, just the essentials, the things that mattered to him, like his clothes and a few books. I stayed behind, staring at the empty spaces he left, feeling like I was drowning in the silence of the apartment that had once been our home. The walls seemed to close in around me, and every corner was a reminder of what we had lost, of what I had lost. I tried to fill the emptiness with work, with social events, with anything that could distract me from the truth. But nothing worked. I could still feel his presence lingering in every room, in every familiar place. Even when I went to bed at night, I could almost hear his voice, his laughter, and for a brief moment, I could imagine that things weren't so broken. But the illusion never lasted. Andrew messaged me a few times during the week, asking if I was okay. I never responded. I couldn't. The last thing I wanted was to involve him in this mess, in the aftermath of a relationship that had slipped through my fingers. I knew I had no right to reach out to him, not while I was still processing everything with Ethan. But the guilt of even ignoring Andrew's concern gnawed at me, and I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the comfort he had offered me, and how it had complicated everything. I kept replaying my conversation with Ethan over and over, the words we had said, the way he had looked at me. It still stung, still burned, the way he had finally admitted that we were done. I never wanted to hear those words, but a part of me knew they were true. We were both too far gone. We couldn't go back to what we had before. The trust had been broken, and no matter how much we tried to patch the cracks, the pieces would never fit together the same way again. I thought about the possibility of reaching out to Ethan, but what would I say? What could I say? He had made it clear that he was done, and a part of me understood why. I had been distant, lost in my own confusion, trying to find solace in someone who wasn't him. I couldn't blame him for walking away. I had pushed him to the edge, and now I was left standing at the ruins of what we had built. The loneliness was suffocating. I couldn't escape it. Even when I went to lunch with friends or met with colleagues, there was always this void that I couldn't fill. They didn't know. They didn't know what it felt like to lose someone you thought you would spend your life with, someone you had shared everything with. I wanted to talk about it, but I couldn't find the words. It felt like too much to explain, too much to carry. And then, on a day that felt like any other, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Ethan. I stared at the screen for a long time, wondering if this was just a last attempt at closure or something more. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," the message read. "I'm not sure what comes next, but I don't want to leave things like this. We need to talk." My heart raced in my chest. I stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to say yes, wanted to see him again, to talk through everything, to find a way back to each other. But another part of me was terrified. What if we just ended up hurting each other more? What if the damage was irreversible? What if we had reached a point where there was nothing left to salvage? I took a deep breath, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I typed, then erased, then typed again. Finally, I sent back a simple reply. "Okay, let's talk." I didn't know where that conversation would lead, what would come from it, or if it would even change anything, but I had to try. I had to try to find some kind of resolution, some kind of peace, because I couldn't keep carrying this weight of regret and guilt around with me. As I sat in my apartment, waiting for him to show up, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. Would this conversation bring closure, or would it only open up old wounds? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I was ready to find out. But I had to face it. I had to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. When the doorbell finally rang, my heart skipped a beat. I stood up, my hands trembling as I walked to the door. I opened it, and there he was. Ethan. His face was a little more worn, a little more tired, but there was still something familiar about the way he looked at me. We didn't speak at first. We just stood there, looking at each other, both of us unsure of what to say next. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I don't know where we go from here, Olivia," he said quietly, "but I don't want to keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not." I nodded, my throat tight. "I know, I don't either." And with that, the silence stretched between us again. Neither of us had the answers. Neither of us knew what came next. But in that moment, I realized that maybe that was okay. Maybe, for now, the only thing we could do was be honest with each other, face the truth, and let the future unfold on its own. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't the resolution I had hoped for, but it was real. And sometimes that was all you could ask for.